for me, it's been a really useful tool, useful reference model. But in another way, as you say, it's a bit of a millstone because I'm sort of known as the 70-20-10 guy.
What's it like to have a long and interesting career summed up in just 6 digits? Let's ask the 70-20-10 guy. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
Ratios rule our world.
Sum of the square roots of any two sides of an isosceles triangle is equal to the square root of the remaining side.
Just think of pi, the golden section, Fibonacci numbers, the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule, and in workplace learning, a particular 6-digit ratio, 70-20-10, has had an enormous influence over everybody's thinking in the last couple of decades. The person responsible for bringing 70-20-10 to the fore is our guest on the Learning Hack this time, Charles Jennings. But there's a lot more to Charles than just that number. For instance, when I first came across his name back in 2001, he was with a company that had developed an LCMS. What's an LCMS?
Hack facts.
LCMS stands for Learning Content Management System, while the much better known LMS or Learning Management System is used, in essence, to house and track various types of learning. The LCMS is designed to help teams of people create digital learning content, managing and reusing content assets, supporting the workflow, and publishing the result as SCORM-compliant courses that can be distributed via an LMS.
Thank you, Kate.
I hope that's clear.
About 80% clear. So, Jay, tell us the themes.
I thought Kate was 100% clear. Anyway, John, in your conversation with Charles, you covered 70-20-10 pretty thoroughly, but also Charles's background in the industry, the influence of knowledge management on his thought, the conspiracy of convenience and hopes for the future. But if there's one overall theme that came across strongly, it was his ability to engage fully with the complexity of modern L&D, but to formulate his advice in a very clear and simple way that makes it easy to understand.
E.g. 70-20-10.
Exactly.
But there really is a lot more to Charles Jennings than 70-20-10, I discovered. It was a really fascinating conversation. Give it a listen. So it's probably fair to say, Charles, that most people associate you with that infamous 6-digit number, or is it a ratio, 70-20-10? On a personal level, how do you feel about that in hindsight? I should say here, regular listeners to this podcast will know that I have a kind of musical background, and I was in a band once that had a hit single. And while you'd never want to wish that away, it does a lot for your life. At the same time, it becomes a bit of a millstone. So I wonder, when somebody's had a big hit, like 70-20-10 with you, I tend to think of it that way. Were you surprised by how it caught on in the industry, how big it became, and has it perhaps become a bit of a millstone?
Yeah, that's a very good question, John. I was surprised. I still am surprised. I'm surprised that it was caught on. I'm surprised that it's so much misunderstood. I think a lot of people have found it extremely useful. A lot of people have been highly critical of 70-20-10. And I should say, I've never seen it as some sort of intervention matrix, and I've never sort of taken the view that this is some nice round numbers, because there's obviously a lot of people will challenge round numbers, this sort of roundism. I've always seen 70-20-10 as a tool, as an approach, as a reference model more than anything else.
Yeah.
And for me, it was really important because I've spent most of my professional career trying to help HR and L&D professionals get out of what I'd call the training bubble.
Yeah.
It's not because I'm anti-training, but because we need to do a lot more than that. And training sometimes is a good start, but it's never going to be enough. And training and learning mindsets really force you down a very, very narrow corridor. And back in 2001, I saw 70-20-10 as a really good way to help in that strategic approach to build a strategy and approach for an organization. In 2001, I went into Reuters to help them make their learning and training function more effective. And a year or so before, I'd seen some work done at Goldman Sachs as part of their accelerated leadership program, where they used this 70-20-10 model as part of this program. And it was very effective. I spoke to people at Goldman's and they said it was great. And it was tough because people who wanted to break through the glass ceiling at Goldman's, they had to show that they could coach and support people. They had to demonstrate that they focus on the what I would call the 70 and the 20, rather than just on the formal. And so what I did in Reuters is build a strategy around this, and it worked really well. And I talked a bit about it, and other people picked it up, and so on. So in that way, it's been a really useful tool, useful reference model. But in another way, as you say, it's a bit of a millstone, because I'm sort of known as the 70-20-10 guy. And actually, what I'm really all about is helping people do their jobs better, because I can think of no other focus and thing we should be trying to do as learning professionals and help people and organizations to perform better. And I used to joke when I was a chief learning officer and say that I may be a CLO, but I'm not terribly interested in learning, but I'm absolutely passionate about performance. So that in that way, 70-20-10 has helped a lot. And also, I think the whole nice round number challenge is an interesting one, because even the work at the Centre for Creative Leadership, where the numbers first came from, didn't produce nice round numbers. You know, it's a bit like saying the Pareto principle is not valid, because when you look at particular instances, it's not 80-20. You know, I mean, that's sort of absurd, really. So the numbers are really, in fact, the original work was only a relatively small study, and in fact, the original numbers that came out of the study at the Centre for Creative Leadership, there were 16 categories. There weren't just the 3 numbers. Right. There were 16 categories. And a guy called Bob Eichinger, who was working with them, Bob had been working with PepsiCo, he looked at this and said, and these are academics, and he said, look, guys, you know, no one's going to understand this. This is too complex. And he looked and he broke them up into 5 categories to make it much more easy to communicate. And then he looked at 2 of the categories, which was around adverse situations and experiences outside of work. And he said, well, first of all, there's no way that we can present people with adverse situations. And in other words, you know, where you're highly likely to fail. And of course, that's going to be development, but, you know, it's just not moral to do that. And what goes on outside of work, away from work, you know, at home, you know, with your family or whatever, we don't have any influence over that. So he took those 2 away. And with the remaining 75%, he looked at it and he said, well, it looks like it's around about 70% of what these high performers say comes from challenging work. About 20% comes from other people. At the time, and this was back in the 80s, at the time, the other people was mostly the boss. And about 10% comes from formal learning and reading. And so he said, this looks like a nice, you know, approach. And then, in fact, when the CCL did some other studies, someone looked at the original study and said, hey, there's only couple of women in here. What would happen if we surveyed successful women? And they did. And they didn't come up with 70-20-10. They came up with 56-38-6. So, you know, about 55-45.
You're going to sound like a Miss World contest. I'm sorry.
That's right, exactly. Yeah. And there was some discussion around whether the learning from experience with women was less, because at that time they weren't given so many opportunities, you know, to develop and lead and so on. And then they did other work in India, and it was 69, 27-4. In China, it was 68, 25-7. So, you know, the numbers are all over the place. But the thing was that work showed something which others had shown, is that most learning appears to occur in the workplace as part of working and working with others. And for me, that's been a really, really powerful message and a really good North Star to work to say learning is not something that just happens in a classroom or in an e-learning module or in some sort of structured environment. Learning happens all the time in all sorts of places. Sometimes there's greater opportunities for learning, sometimes less, but let's look across the whole panorama, and let's get L&D involved in supporting learning and making sure that we're learning from working as well as learning to work. We're learning from and with others, as well as anything else. So for me, that's where it's really been powerful, I think. And it does bother me that a lot of people still see this as an intervention matrix, and it's a bit like learning styles. You're trying to design your learning to fit these nice numbers. That's sort of crazy, really.
Yeah, that's so interesting about the incredible specificity there that gets honed down into just those three numbers. There's a saying in sort of politics: there's two things you should never see being made, and is it law and sausages? There's something about the kind of process by which academic models come into the mainstream that is a bit like sausage making.
So true. Yeah, and of course we all know that learning, everything is more complex than that.
Yes.
That's why I always refer to 70-20-10 as a reference model. And more recently, in my work with my colleagues, we tend to refer to performance-based learning with 70-20-10 inside, because that helps people focus on, it's all about individual, team and organizational performance. That's what we're working on.
Looking at it from my perspective over the years, what I could see is that its power as an idea was that it kind of represented a shift of mindset, getting people to look beyond formal learning, in other words, 10%, and to realize that there was a lot of other stuff going on around that they might intervene with in various ways. And it really did open up people's thinking, I think. So how do you reflect now on the job it did in changing the character of workplace learning? That might sound like a rather kind of grandiose claim for it, but I think in a way it did.
I think it's played a role, John. I think it's played its part. And absolutely, you're right on that first point. It's not just a shift in mindset, but I think that it helps shift in practice. And that's certainly the work I've been doing. Most of my work has been focused on how do we change practices? How do we change learning and development professional practices to address all aspects of learning? And in fact, inside my current organization, we talk a lot about the fact that, learning is learning. It's trying to silo it into different bits is not very helpful. Sometimes it might be useful just to be able to get a clearer view, but actually it's not very helpful. And 70-20-10 should just be about improving business impact. And when I see a lot of work that's done around 70-20-10, and my colleagues are always very careful not to criticize people, but very often what they're doing is what we call 10+. In other words, they're doing a really good formal learning. They're extending their formal learning programs into social learning and into workplace learning. And I think a lot of what is called workplace learning is actually formal learning in the workplace. I don't want to denigrate that at all. I think that's really great, but there are opportunities beyond that. And one of the things that I've done with my colleagues certainly over the last 6 or 7 years, we developed a methodology a few years ago now around 70-20-10 and focused on performance. It basically brings together HPI, human performance improvement, and performance consulting, brings those together. And we develop new roles and base it all around critical tasks rather than competencies and so on. And also bringing into that mix is the fact that, we've been told for years that a lot of the problems in organizations are not down to lack of knowledge and skills. I mean, the famous J. Edwards Deming, the great leading thinker on performance improvement, said that 94% of problems in an organization are caused by the system, not by the people. And Gary Rumler, who's a great leader in the HPI movement, said 90% of performance gaps are caused by organizational barriers, not by knowledge deficits. And I think 70-20-10 in a way helps lever us out of the knowledge skills problem in terms of people seeing problems as lack of knowledge, lack of skills, rather than as looking at it systemically and saying, what is it, why is it that this part of the organization or this team is not able to work to its optimum, to its maximum. Let's look at the problems, not just with the people, but let's look at it systemically and look at the problems with the process. Let's look at the problems with the design, with all those sorts of things. So I think that for me, it's helped people think a little bit more, and we've seen that. I mean, we've seen it over the last years, we've seen a much more awareness that a lot of learning happens in the workplace, that as L&D professionals, we need to think about that. We need to, it's very difficult. I mean, Jay Cross always said one of the problems, I remember talking to Jay, I work with Jay, and he would often say, Charles, the problem is a lot of managers and a lot of L&D people can't separate schooling from learning. They don't know the difference between the two, and therefore they often revert back to, we've got a problem, so we have a schooling answer. And I think 70-20-10 has helped us get out, to a certain extent, out of that schooling mindset.
Before we move on to what you're doing now, which I think is, would be the logical place to go now, I'd like to take a step back. You and I have talked about your past, and how many coincidences there, how many times our paths have crossed over the years, because we've both been in the industry for quite a while. You've been in it for longer than I am. I first came across your name back in 2001 in connection with learning content management systems. But how did you get into learning technologies before that? And what was it attracted you to it? And you talk a bit about your journey during the first two heady decades of this century.
Sure. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey, John. I mean, I first got involved in learning technologies seriously in the early 80s. And after the IBM PC and the Apple II were produced in 79 and early 80s, some enlightened soul in the Thatcher government in the UK came to the view that maybe these personal computers were going to be more useful to things other than, computing science students. And so they set up a number of centres of excellence around the UK to support various use of PCs. So there's one on expert systems, one on artificial intelligence, one on computer-aided language learning, computer-aided CAD/CAM, and I headed up the centre for what was called electronic communications. In fact, I was a professor of electronic communications. Everyone thought I was an electronic engineer, but it was actually around. It was a centre for network-based learning. It had a long civil service name, but basically we were involved in using technology and using networks for collaborative learning. So we ran online programs. We ran, I think, the first cross-country online programs in business and languages between England, France, and Germany back in the early 80s. We did a lot of early work with the Open University. I was involved in launching the world's first pure online MBA just before I left academia in 1995. So I was involved in certainly in using, in fact, we had one of the very, very early web servers. I remember it was 131 was its number. And so I was involved there. Then I came out of mainstream education and went and worked, had a role as a director of strategic technology, grand title, at Dow Jones Markets, the financial markets part of Dow Jones. I should say before my fellow countryman Rupert Murdoch got his grubby little claws on it. But and there I was involved in developing performance support systems. And that sort of really opened my eyes, because I was asked initially to provide some training for sales and marketing people around the world. And when we analysed the problems that they were facing, we found that the problems were nothing to do with training. The problems were really to do with communications and people having access to the right bits of information, the right knowledge to be able to do their jobs at the right time. So if a Dow Jones person was, maybe working in Hong Kong with Citibank, they needed to know who else had worked with Citibank on this type of project, who else had worked in Hong Kong, this sort of project. And they basically needed some sort of performance support knowledge management system. So I got involved in that. Out of that, I left Dow Jones when Dow Jones Markets was sold off. I left Dow Jones, and that's when I went and worked with the organisation that you came in contact, where we came in contact first, which was called the Online Courseware Factory. And I got together with some other colleagues, mostly academics or former academics, and we realised that learning objects were just emerging, and that we really needed technologies to be able to manage content in a structured way. SCORM was just appearing. In fact, I was involved in writing papers around definitions of SCORM definitions using XML rather than Java, and so on way back. So I got involved in that, and that was interesting because learning content management systems, I felt really were slightly out of. They were a little before their time, and then they were overtaken. Of course, SCORM is still used widely. So I came from that, then went into to Reuters as chief learning officer, and that's when I sort of rolled my sleeves up and got into doing it. In fact, I went in as a consultant and had the consultant's nightmare because I designed and defined a strategy for them based around 70-20-10, and the CEO asked me to, and the HR director asked me to come and do it, and I said to them, well, that's not the way that it normally works. As a consultant, you do the analysis, you define the strategy, you write the report, you present it to the board, they give you the check, and you go away.
And then it's your problem now.
That's right. Yes, exactly. Yeah, but it was such a good organisation.
Very familiar from my consulting career. Yeah, and then you get the job, and you actually have to do it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So then you have to roll your sleeves up. So that was sort of my history in learning technology. And learning generally, and it's been a really interesting ride watching the technology develop from way back in the early X25 networks, before the web appeared, and interactive video discs, 12-inch laser discs, training systems on those, and all the others in between. What we've got now.
You are data.
You are data. You are data. You are data.
Every pulse of your heart, every step you take, the place you travel to, the thing that gets your attention, it all leaves a trace in data. And the world reconfigures itself around you, moment to moment, based on that data.
You are data. You are data.
Data has learned a lot about you over the years. Isn't it time you learned more about data?
You are data. You are data. You are data. You are data.
Data is a hot topic in learning right now, perhaps the hottest. But when you look at what's happened historically with learning analytics, it's hard to deny that it's been a little bit stuck. Stuck in the first two levels of Kirkpatrick. Stuck in what David Wilson and Charles Jennings have called the conspiracy of convenience. Stuck in a lack of capability, money, and time to evaluate. So how can we get ourselves out of this endless Mobius loop of wanting to do it all, but ending up not actually doing very much? I've talked to a lot of experts and practitioners, and the result is a whole series of guides and resources that Learning Pool will be releasing to help you map your way out of that loop. Download the first of these now. The Data and Learning White Paper.
You are data. You are data. You are data.
During that time, you had a foot in knowledge management, at least one foot in knowledge management. Has that informed your perspective in an important way, do you think?
Absolutely. And knowledge management, again, has changed a lot. But knowledge management used to be data-centric, then it became process-centric, and now it's people-centric. And that's a sort of well-defined route that it's taken. And certainly in the mid-90s, when I was working at Dow Jones, and the performance support knowledge management piece sort of were crossovers there. And it's always surprised me that L&D and knowledge management are still very, very different. In many organizations are very separate professions and disciplines, whereas it's really clear that they're aiming for the same thing and really should be joined at the hip, if not totally integrated together. Because, access to the right information at the right time, in the right context, is absolutely critical to helping people do their jobs better, which is what we're all about. We're all about. And just having one tool, which is, the formal learning tool, or just having the KM tool, just seems crazy. We need to have the whole toolkit.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly coming together in this podcast. We had Harold Yorke earlier on, and we're hoping to get some more people from the KM side of the fence, because they do seem to lie kind of alongside each other. So your latest venture is Tulser, which, if I'm right, has grown out of the 70-20-10 Institute. Can you tell us something about that, its aims and the thinking behind it?
Sure, John. Actually, it's not quite right. Tulser is a Dutch business that's run by my colleagues in the 70-20-10 Institute, Jos Arets, who is a former CLO in healthcare, and Vivian Heinen. And they've been running Tulser since around 2008. So Tulser is a very well-established company in the Netherlands. And they're leaders in the field of performance support. And I think that's what really put us together. They've been doing really great work for a long time. They've written groundbreaking books around HPI, human performance improvement, performance support. They wrote a great book in Dutch called Costly Misconceptions about the cost of having a training mindset. And that was back, 12 or 15 years ago. And so Jos, Vivian and I got together in 2015 in the 70-20-10 Institute, and we've grown it from there. Out of the book, which was written called 70-20-10 Towards 100% Performance, written primarily by Jos, but out of that came this 70-20-10 or performance-based learning methodology. And the work we do now is we came to the view that 70-20-10 is something which people either love it or hate it. In the English context, it's a bit like Marmite. In my Australian context, it's a bit like Vegemite. You're one or the other, you're not both. So we found that 70-20-10, some organizations find it really useful. Some change its name. A lot of organizations use terms like the 3 E's, learning from education, or learning from experience, exposure, and education. So 70 being the experience, 20 being the exposure to others, 10 being the education. There's other acronyms and terms people use. But we found that performance-based learning was really a good way to structure and think about this. And so what we do now, primarily within what we call Tulser Global, which is the global part of the Dutch Tulser, is focused on these things, on the performance-based learning, the 70-20-10 inside, and also a whole new area that Jos is just completing 2 books on around value-based learning, where Jos has developed these archetypal new business models for L&D, maturity models, if you like, moving from order taking into value creation, how we can really reposition L&D in terms of our value proposition using standard business approaches, change our value proposition from simply being a taker of orders into being a deliverer of value and all the steps in between. So that's the journey we're on. And to be honest, that's why, I continue to work and really continue to enjoy what I'm doing, because it feels as though we're making progress and the whole profession is moving forward and grasping the nettle of how do we help our organizations and our people work better and, get into this cycle of continuous improvement.
I'd like to move on now to maybe one of your other hits. Maybe this is more of an indie hit on the indie charts, slightly less high profile than 70-20-10. And that's a phrase I came across when I was researching a paper for Learning Pool, which I wrote with Ben Betts on data in learning. And this was about the conspiracy of convenience, which is another of those resonant phrases that gets picked up a lot. In this case, it's something I think David Wilson was involved. So if it was on Spotify, it would have featuring David Wilson, like one of those rap tracks, maybe Lil Kim as well, a couple other people. And something you identified in conversation with him. Can you describe, for the purposes of people who don't know it quite well, what that idea is briefly? And also, I'd like to know if you think it's still in place when it comes to L&D in their relation to using data in evaluation, and how you feel more broadly about the role of L&D in organizations now, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah, David Wilson, as you say, came up with the conspiracy of convience. And
you're blaming it on him now, I see.
Yeah, I'm blaming it on him, yes. No, well, it sort of is attached to him and me, but it's David's. But basically it was absolutely hit a nail with me, and so I've used it mercifully, and basically it works like this. So if we think about what often happens in organizations, a manager or a leader or an HR business partner will come to L&D leaders and say, we need a training course on XYZ. We need training. Our people need training. Something's not working the way we expect it to, so we need training. So that's the first step. The second step is that no one carries out an analysis of what is the cause of the problem, the importance of it, or the impact of it. And so the training or L&D manager who feel that their job is to deliver what we used to call training, we now call learning and development. So we design, we go through our process of we design, develop, and deliver the training. No one measures it beyond maybe some happy sheets or something like that. It has little or no impact, but everyone's happy. So that's why it's a conspiracy, because everyone feels they've done their job. The managers feel they've done the job. They've got a problem. They've got their schooling hats on, and they've said, oh, this must, if we train our people, no analysis, we assume it's like a lack of knowledge, skills, or whatever. It's a people problem. So pass it over to L&D. L&D's job is to design, develop, deliver some sort of learning intervention. As I say, no one's, before they start, have thought about what's the business impact we're looking at here? What is the root cause of the problem? What aspect of the problem is due to the people? What is due to the processes? What is due to what I would call environmental factors, other factors? No one's done any of that analysis. And then when we come to measure it, they try and utilize this measure. Well, they're measuring activity, basically. And we've been trying, certainly all my career, people have been trying to use learning metrics to determine business impact, and that's just not possible. And so nothing happens, everyone's happy, and on we go. Now, I'd like to think there was a lot less of that today, but a lot less of the conspiracy of convenience, but I fear that there's still quite a bit of it around. And it's not, I don't want to blame anyone, but I mean, I wouldn't hold the blame at L&D for that, because a lot of the responsibility for that comes to the lack of education of business leaders, HR business partners, and others who, when they see a problem, they assume that it's going to be solved by schooling. They assume it's going to be solved by fixing the people, and going back to Deming and others, often the problem is not the people. When the problem is the people, sure, we'll need some interventions which are going to help fix that. But it's that mindset and that what we call the training bubble. It's getting caught into that training bubble and not getting out. And that, for me, is one of the big challenges that we really must do, because, we're never going to solve it. We're going to always just be a sideline player in the value that we're creating for our organizations if we just focus on churning out, onboarding programs, compliance programs, all those sorts of programs, first level manager programs and so on, without looking at the bigger picture and saying, how can we help everyone to continuously improve in their existing roles and develop in preparation for future roles? And how can we align that with the performance of our organization? It doesn't matter whether that's a government department where you're looking for high levels of citizen satisfaction of your, for want of a better word, of your customers, or whether you're working in any sort of area. It's, unless we think more widely, we're never going to get there.
Just for clarity, to come back to something you said in there quite quickly in passing, you said, and then they try to measure business impact, and you simply can't do that. Am I getting this wrong? Are you saying that you can't measure business impact from training interventions?
It's extremely difficult. We've known for years. So let me roll back a little bit. We've known for years that performance. There's a principle called the principle of identical elements, developed by two eminent American psychologists in 1901. Mm-hmm. Okay, so 120 years ago. And the principle of identical elements is based around the fact that the context where you learn to do something, the closer that is to the context in which you're going to use it, the more effective it's going to be. So, you know, what we're talking about, this is early training transfer stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so the wider, the more different the context is. So that's one of the challenges that we have, in that the closer to the point of use that you learn or gain the guidance to do something, the more effective it's likely to be. So the point I was making is, when you're looking at formal learning, people have been trying for years and years. Jack Phillips and others have been trying for years and years to measure the business impact. It can be done. It's done. I think the figure is something like 4% of formal learning solutions. You're able to measure the business impact of 4%. And the question I would challenge or ask is that good enough? And the answer is no. For me, it certainly is no. We should be able to measure at least 50%, if not more. And the answer to that is, well, we need to use the right metrics. So we need to be able to make sure that we're using very, very clear business metrics rather than learning metrics to do that. And people like Dean Spitzer, who has written a great book, Training Results Management, it was called initially. It changed its name because when training went out of and learning became more the common term. But Dean did this great work. Dean was at IBM, did this great work in his causal chain analysis and so on. Incredibly complex, and you can see why 4%. You can do it 4% of the time. But if you start from the other end, and in our 70-20-10 performance-based learning methodology, you start with the organizational results, the organization's results, and then you focus on critical tasks, not competencies. So you say, what are those critical tasks that are needed in order to achieve those results? How can we support those critical tasks? And then what you're measuring is the output of those critical tasks and linking it back. And it's much, much easier doing it that way.
We've just been through the pandemic and still very much going through it at the time of this interview. Hopefully things will ease up in the coming months, and it's given a boost to learning technology. It's been, it's actually, don't want to be too noisy about it, but it's been very good for the industry in many ways. What are your hopes and fears for learning technologies and learning more generally as we move forward from these difficult years?
Yeah, it has been really tough for everyone, but as you say, I don't want to make too much noise about it, but it has given a big boost to the use of technology for working, actually for learning. And these, digital transformation projects that have been running for years in organizations were suddenly magically carried through within a few months when we were first hit with this. But I think the major opportunity and the major challenges are actually much bigger than technology for learning. Technology is one enabling tool. It's an important enabling tool. And we're certainly seeing some great new technologies emerging in the L&D arena, without a doubt. But we've still got this problem that Jay Cross described as, this learning schooling difference. So we need to think about that mindset change as well as the technology. And I'd add that the current situation actually offers us opportunities to break free of a whole range of other long-held practices. So, we were just talking about trying to use learning metrics to determine business impact. Yep. Now, this is a great time to start to think about that. Seeing learning as something that's delivered and context-centric. We know that learning is an activity. Learning is the output of, I often say, we learn through rich and challenging experiences. We learn through opportunities to practice. We learn through deep conversations and having good networks, knowing the right people to ask the right question. And we learn through reflective practice. And I often say to people, hold those up to what you're doing. If you're developing a new program, if you're developing a new e-learning program or whatever, hold those things. Is this helping people to do all of those? If it is, you're likely to be on the right track. I think that one of the other things that we need to break out of is thinking about learning rather than performance. So moving from this learning paradigm, and certainly in Tulser, we talk a lot about moving from the learning paradigm into the performance paradigm and all the things that go with that. And lastly, really around the focus on the individual, the primacy of the individual for L&D. And you can see where it's come from, John. It's come from the personnel department, the HR department, which was focused around how do we onboard individuals, how do we make sure that they're paid right, how do we make sure that they're measured in their performance and so on. So I think L&D has got caught in that focus on individuals rather than on organizations in terms of what the output, what the impact is going to be for our organization. And of course, individuals contribute to that, but that's not the whole piece, because I think it's a real opportunity now for L&D to sit back and think about, how can I help? If I was an L&D practitioner in an organization, I think I should be thinking about, how can I make sure, how can I contribute in a measurable way to the agility of my organization, to the responsiveness of my organization to change, to the process of continuous improvement in my organization, all those sorts of things, rather than getting caught on a treadmill of competencies, of skills matrices, of individuals, developing individuals, taking a step back and thinking wider, because I would guarantee that none of us achieve what we achieve alone. You know, you walk into any organization and all of us work in teams, we work in multiple teams usually, and yet L&D still predominantly seems to be focused on individuals. I wouldn't, not exclusively, of course, but it seems to be a major thing. And probably for another podcast, there's one of the issues I see is this HR-centric focus of L&D. And as we know, L&D tends to flop between, out of the business and back into HR, and certainly in big organizations. And HR tends, by the nature of the processes it needs to undertake, focus on individual employees. And L&D's got a much bigger role than that. It really has a role to improve the organization's performance. And you talk to any HR leader, and they would probably, I'm sure they would say, and I've had them say to me, yeah, my responsibility as head of remuneration is part of managing the organization's performance. And I agree with that. But it tends to hold, I think it tends to hold L&D back a little in terms of focusing us on objective set, that whole cycle of objective setting and performance reviews and all those sorts of things, and assessing people on an individual basis. Again, organizations are moving away from that. Certainly some are moving into, team objective setting and team evaluations and so on. But it is very slow. And I think the current situation is giving opportunities for L&D to do a lot more, a lot faster, and have greater impact.
Enough meat to think about there for several more podcasts, I think, and the questions are coming in my brain as I'm listening to that. But for now, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. Been a pleasure.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Charles and to our sponsors, Learning Pool. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. Please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
You can tweet me at John Helmer or contact me through my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com. We're always keen to get your feedback, so let us have it, good or bad.
Coming up on the Learning Hack,
we have Toby Harris on avoiding filter failure, Greg Collins, Mirjam Neelan, and many others. So till next time,
stay classy, learning people.
Now I finally get it.
strap.
Oh, very nice, very nice. Lovely, isn't it? Nice? Yeah.